Welcome to our deep dive. This time, we're looking at quite a few headlines from around the globe. We're going from India all the way to Florida, even to the Middle East. So quite a lot to get through, but luckily we have our expert here to help us connect all the dots.
The key, I think, to recognize here is that we're not looking at isolated events. We're looking at really a web of interconnected challenges.
Yeah.
And the responses are also interconnected. Whether we're looking at political shifts in one region that impacts, economic giants like the Adani Group in India, or a natural disaster like we've seen in Florida, these events really offer a window into the complex dynamics that are happening around the world.
Okay, so let's jump into it with some specific stories. We're going to start off in India. Um, the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, is celebrating some pretty big wins in the Maharashtra elections. According to sources like the Hindustan Times and the Indian Expresses, this is actually their strongest showing in decades. So what makes this election so significant?
This victory, as reported by the Hindustan Times and Indian Express, it goes beyond just the numbers. It signals a potential consolidation of power for the BJP, and not just regionally, but nationally as well. And it's going to be interesting to see how this influences their strategy going forward, what this means for opposition parties. And we also have to look at the bypoll results that are coming out of Kerala and Bihar. These offer further clues about the evolving political landscape.
And speaking of things that could shake up that landscape, the Gautam Adani situation is making headlines. The Indian Express is reporting on arrest warrants that were issued in the U.S. for bribery. And we're looking at the potential consequences for the Adani Group, one of India's most powerful conglomerates.
The scandal, as detailed by the Indian Express, could have serious implications for the Adani Group, and it has the potential to kind of ripple out, impact investor confidence and the Indian economy. The question is really now how the Indian government will respond to these allegations, and what steps, if any, they'll take to address the concerns about corporate accountability.
And then adding to this, we have the Hindustan Times and the Hindu reporting on Delhi's battle with air pollution. The levels are reaching a severe level. And this isn't a new problem for Delhi, but it does seem to be getting worse.
Right. And this highlights the challenges that India faces in balancing rapid economic growth with protecting the environment. And it raises some really important questions about sustainability and the impact that industrialization has on public health. And this isn't just a local issue for Delhi either. We've seen these challenges in major cities around the world.
Right. So shifting gears geographically, but maybe not thematically, Hurricane Milton has just slammed into Florida, leaving behind a path of destruction. CNN and Al Jazeera are reporting that it reached Category 5, and it unleashed record-breaking tornadoes across the state. Over 3 million people are without power, and AccuWeather and CNN are reporting gas shortages.
This storm, as documented by sources like CNN and Al Jazeera, is a stark reminder of the increasing intensity of natural disasters, which many scientists are linking to climate change. It exposes vulnerabilities in our infrastructure and raises critical questions about our disaster preparedness. And the political fallout is already unfolding, with potential implications for future disaster relief efforts, and even the 2024 presidential election, as CNN has reported.
And all of this is happening as families are getting ready to travel for Thanksgiving. I can't imagine trying to navigate those disrupted travel routes. And gas shortages.
It's a perfect example of how local events can have consequences that cascade, impacting everything from personal plans to national economic trends. The timing couldn't be worse for people hoping to get together with their loved ones for the holiday.
Now, let's turn our attention over to China, a nation that seems to be walking a bit of a tightrope right now between bolstering its own economic power while also navigating some increasingly complex international relations.
Bloomberg has highlighted this balancing act, and we're seeing it play out. In a couple of recent developments, the removal of a buoy near the Senkaku Islands, which is a point of contention with Japan, as reported by Kyoto News, this suggests a desire to ease tensions in that region. However, at the same time, CNN is reporting that the U.S. is still concerned about China's continued military activities surrounding Taiwan. And there are accusations of cyber espionage targeting American interests.
So it's a pretty multifaceted situation that seems to involve a lot of strategic calculations on multiple fronts.
Precisely. China is a major player on the global stage, and their actions have the potential to significantly impact the global economy, international security, and the delicate balance of power in the 21st century. We need to pay close attention to how these events unfold and what they signal about China's long-term goals.
And then while all of this is happening, Europe is facing a potential new energy crisis. As covered extensively by Fortune magazine, Deutsche Welle is also reporting on a diplomatic row between Europe and Niger Regarding flood aid,
The energy situation is particularly worrying, especially with winter coming up. Fortune magazine's analysis paints a pretty stark picture of dwindling gas reserves and the possibility of supply cuts from Russia. This could lead to some really severe economic and social consequences, as we saw last year.
so it seems like a very precarious situation, made even more complex by the diplomatic tensions with Niger over flood aid.
It underlines the fragility of global cooperation in the face of multiple overlapping crises.
It is inspiring, though, to see those protests against violence against women gaining momentum across Europe, as reported by Euronews.
These demonstrations are a powerful sign of a growing awareness of this critical issue and a demand for some systemic change.
Finally, we arrive at the Middle East, a region that feels like it's teetering on the brink right now. Drone strikes, escalating conflict, and Gaza military exercises in the South China Sea. It feels like the whole world is holding its breath.
These interconnected conflicts have the potential to escalate rapidly with some unpredictable and far-reaching consequences. Sources like the Economic Times and The Independent are providing in-depth coverage, but the situation remains incredibly volatile. What's needed right now is a focus on diplomacy and de-escalation.
So, a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
But we're just getting started. What's the one thing you want our listener to keep in mind as we move into part 2 of this deep dive?
I think the key takeaway, even at this early stage, is that we are living in a world that's increasingly complex and interconnected. What happens in one corner of the globe can and does have ripple effects everywhere.
Stay tuned. Welcome back to part 2 of our deep dive. Let's zoom in on some of the specifics. And starting with India, you were particularly interested in those bipole results. And The Hindu is reporting that this CPI, or Communist Party of India, is actually leading by a substantial margin in Kerala. And this is notable because it challenges that usual Congress stronghold in the state. So we're potentially seeing a shift in the balance of power in Kerala. That could have implications for national politics as well. What about the bipole results in Bihar?
The Hindustan Times is reporting that the ruling NDA, the National Democratic Alliance, is ahead in 2 out of 4 constituencies in Bihar. And these outcomes could really impact future political alignments and strategies there, as parties are kind of jostling for influence.
It does seem like the political landscape in India is in a state of flux, with these bipole results potentially signaling some larger shifts to come. But beyond just those election outcomes, there's the Gautam Adani situation that we touched on earlier. What are some of the broader implications of this scandal, and how is it being perceived within India?
The Indian Express is highlighting the potential damage to the Adani Group, which plays a significant role in India's economy. And there are concerns about the impact on investor confidence, not just in the Adani Group itself, but potentially in Indian businesses more broadly. The scandal also raises questions about corporate accountability and the role of government oversight.
It's a complex situation with a lot of moving parts. It'll be interesting to see how it unfolds in the coming months. Okay, let's shift our focus now to the devastation in Florida caused by Hurricane Milton. You flagged this as a major concern, and I have to say the images and reports coming out of the region are truly heartbreaking. What stands out to you about the coverage of this disaster?
What's particularly striking, as reported by CNN, is the unprecedented tornado activity that accompanied the hurricane. Over 30 tornadoes were reported, a number that's unheard of for Florida. And this adds a whole other layer of complexity to those recovery efforts, as rescue workers and residents are now having to contend with widespread wind damage in addition to the flooding and the power outages.
And as AccuWeather and CNN have pointed out, those gas shortages are compounding the challenges. Faced by those trying to rebuild their lives and their communities, the timing couldn't be worse. With Thanksgiving right around the corner, how do you see this disaster impacting the political landscape, especially with Governor DeSantis criticizing the federal response?
Well, the situation in Florida is becoming a focal point for political debate and finger-pointing. Governor DeSantis' criticism of the federal response, as reported by CNN, is likely to further fuel this debate, and it could have implications for future disaster relief policies. It's also worth noting that this event could become a factor in the 2024 presidential election, particularly as the conversation around climate change and disaster preparedness intensifies.
So we're seeing those ripple effects you mentioned earlier, a local event with the potential to impact national politics, and perhaps even international discussions on climate change. Now let's dive into China's delicate balancing act. They've taken steps to ease tensions with Japan, such as removing the buoy near the Senkaku Islands, as reported by Kyoto News. Yet at the same time, CNN reports that U.S. officials are expressing concern over China's cyber espionage activities. How do you interpret these seemingly contradictory actions?
China's actions reflect a complex strategy of pursuing its interests on multiple fronts. The removal of the buoy, as reported by Kyodo News, is a calculated move to try and improve relations with Japan, a key economic partner. However, the concerns over cyber espionage, as highlighted by CNN, suggest that China is also willing to engage in activities that other nations perceive as adversarial, particularly when it comes to securing a technological and economic edge.
It seems like China is playing a long game here, carefully calibrating its actions to achieve specific goals. What should our listener be paying attention to as China's story continues to unfold?
I think it's crucial to understand that China's actions will have a profound impact on the global economy, international security, and the balance of power in the 21st century, paying attention to their economic policies, their military activities, and their diplomatic engagements, as covered by sources like Bloomberg and CNN, will provide some valuable insights into their strategic direction.
So staying informed about China isn't just about following international news. It's about understanding the forces that are going to be shaping our future. Now let's move on to Europe, which is grappling with some pretty serious challenges right now. The energy crisis is back in the headlines, and Fortune magazine is reporting that it could be even worse than what we saw last year. What makes this situation so precarious?
Well, Fortune magazine's highlighting several factors that are contributing to this crisis, including dwindling gas reserves in Europe and the potential for further supply cuts from Russia, particularly as tensions over the war in Ukraine continue. And this is coming at a time when energy demand is typically high due to the approaching winter.
So we're talking about a potential energy crisis in the middle of winter with limited options for alternative energy sources. That's a recipe for economic hardship. And social unrest. How are European leaders responding to this threat?
They're scrambling to secure alternative sources of energy, encouraging conservation measures, and even considering rationing in some cases. However, it's unclear if these efforts will be enough to avert a full-blown crisis, especially if the winter is particularly harsh.
It's a stark reminder of Europe's dependence on Russian gas and the vulnerability that comes with it. But amid these challenges, there's also this wave of activism sweeping across Europe. You included several articles about these protests against violence against women, and Euronews is reporting on widespread demonstrations taking place in multiple countries. What message do you think these demonstrations are sending?
These demonstrations are sending a powerful message that violence against women is no longer acceptable and that systemic change is needed. The fact that these protests are happening across multiple countries suggests that this is a pan-European movement with significant momentum. This is an issue that has been overlooked and downplayed for far too long. And these protests are a sign that people are demanding action.
It is encouraging to see people coming together to demand change, even amidst the turmoil and the uncertainty that seems to be swirling around the world. Okay, our last stop on this whirlwind tour is the Middle East. As we mentioned before, the region is on the brink of major conflict, and the stakes are incredibly high. What are some of the key factors driving this escalation, and what should we be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
The key factors are long-standing tensions between Israel and Palestine, as well as the increasing involvement of regional and global powers. The situation is incredibly complex and volatile, with a long history of conflict and mistrust. Sources like the Economic Times and The Independent are providing in-depth coverage of the latest developments, including drone strikes, escalating violence, and rising civilian casualties.
And it's not just a regional conflict anymore. The G7 defense ministers are meeting in Naples to discuss these escalating conflicts, highlighting the global concern over what's happening in the Middle East. The Economic Times reported on this meeting, emphasizing its focus on security in Africa, the Asia-Pacific, and NATO strategies.
Absolutely. These events have far-reaching implications and the potential to destabilize the entire region.
Welcome back to part 3 of our deep dive. Let's shift our focus back to the Middle East, where the situation in Gaza is particularly alarming. Reports are surfacing. And while we always have to be cautious about information that comes out of conflict zones, there are indications that a drone strike may have targeted the Israeli Prime Minister's residence. This combined with Israel's intensification of military operations. In southern Lebanon, targeting Hezbollah positions, as reported by sources like The Independent, suggests a dangerous escalation of this conflict.
It's a deeply concerning development, and it seems that the international community is taking notice. You included an article from the Economic Times about the G7 defense ministers meeting in Naples to discuss these escalating conflicts, highlighting the global concern over what's happening in the Middle East. It's not just a regional issue anymore. Exactly. These events have far-reaching implications. And the G7 meeting, as reported by the Economic Times, underscores the potential for these conflicts to spill over
Yeah.
and destabilize the entire region. And then we have Russia conducting nuclear readiness tests, which are being closely monitored by the world. As reported by sources like The Independent, it's a sobering reminder that the conflict in Ukraine still has the potential to escalate into something far more dangerous.
It does feel like we're living in a time of constant crisis, with threats emerging from multiple directions. That can be overwhelming to process all of this information and try to make sense of what it means for the future.
It's understandable to feel that way, but I think it's important to remember that even amidst all of this turmoil, there are glimmers of hope. The protests against violence against women in Europe, as covered by Euronews, are a testament to the power of people demanding change, and China's decision to remove that buoy near the Senkaku Islands, as reported by Kyodo News, shows that even in a world of geopolitical tension, diplomacy can sometimes prevail.
Those are important reminders. It's easy to get caught up in the negativity and lose sight of the fact that there are people who are working to create a better world.
It's about recognizing that we're not just passive observers of these events, we have the power to shape the future, whether it's through activism, engagement in political discourse, or simply by staying informed and making conscious choices in our daily lives.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into a world on edge, what's the final thought you want to leave our listener with?
The world is complex and interconnected, and it's facing a multitude of challenges, from political instability to climate change and the threat of conflict. But within these challenges lie opportunities for positive change. Stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
And keep exploring. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.